Hello, everyone, and welcome to GovCon Roundup Live, episode number 6. My name is Carroll Bernard, and I'm joined by my awesome co-host, the Honorable Stephen Koprince. How you doing today, Stephen?
Hey, Carol, doing great. And honorable, I guess, is just a character reference because I'm not a judge or anything like that. But it would be cool if I was, but I'm not. Good to see you, Carol. Happy New Year to you.
Likewise. We've got a lot to get to today, so we'll try to move a little bit fast, Stephen. I've got 5 topics on the agenda here I want to get to. First, I want to talk about the National Defense Authorization Act, which passed in December. Get your take on that. Also, we'll want to talk about how the competitive landscape has changed for small businesses in 2025, where you see things heading in 2026. Want to talk about some pending FAR and DFAR regulations that contractors need to watch for and know about. We'll talk a little bit about an important change that's come into SAM.gov registration, and then what new opportunities are ahead, perhaps, in the crystal ball. So let's take those one by one, Stephen, and let's start out with the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act. What's your take on it? Any good news, any surprises? What should we know?
Yeah. So every year, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, historically by fairly large vote margins, usually passes what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, which is to authorize appropriations for the Department of Defense or Department of War. I'm going to probably just say DoD because that's the terminology the bill uses. And that bill doesn't actually appropriate the money, but it authorizes those appropriations. And because it's one of the few bills you can count on every year to pass on a bipartisan basis, it's where you often see a lot of other initiatives that are put in that bill that may be related directly to DoD only or even government wide. And so every year I take a look and others in the field take a look and say, what is Congress putting in related to government contracting in this year's NDAA? Because it's often a way where initiatives that might not be able to pass the Congress on a standalone basis for whatever reason are able to get through as part of the NDAA. I'm going to mention 2 things that were not in the final NDAA.
Yeah, that's important.
They're important too, because there are 2 things that were not in there that I think folks should know about. They still have some strong bipartisan support, but not enough to get through the NDAA this year. So the House and Senate each pass a separate version, and they get together in a conference committee and hash out a final draft. For 2 years running, the House has passed what would be a pretty robust set-aside program for veteran-owned small businesses, VOSBs, that are not service-disabled. They're not owned and controlled by service-disabled veterans. And so right now, the VA is the only agency that has authority to issue sole source and set-aside contracts for VOSBs. Other agencies do not have that authority under the FAR. The House, for 2 years in a row, has voted on a wide bipartisan basis to give the DoD that authority to do set-aside and sole source contracts for VOSBs, and in fact to create a 5% goal for VOSB contracting at DoD. And 2 years in a row now, the Senate has shot it down. The Senate has not agreed to that amendment. So if you're a VOSB, call your senators, because they're the ones who have held this up for a couple years now on the Senate side. So that provision passed the House version, did not make it into the final bill. Second, and this is surprising, so there was a provision that passed both the House and the Senate. They're substantively the same, but had some wording differences, but substantively the same, to overhaul how the DoD uses the CPAR system. And CPARS is the Contract Performance Assessment Rating System, and so it's the Past Performance Rating System for those who aren't familiar with that acronym. So it's how they evaluate and use past performance, how the government does that. And what this, essentially through this big database called CPARS, there's other ways you can look at past performance too, but it's kind of the official database for government past performance reviews, and contracting officers will look at that database when they're evaluating past performance, often on an acquisition. And so the House and Senate both said, look, we're going to change this. We think it's too subjective, these past performance ratings. We think there's grade inflation, essentially, that a lot of contractors are getting outstanding ratings when in fact they really just did an average job. They didn't exceed the contract in any way. So we have problems with how the system is being used, and so we're going to impose a requirement that the DoD essentially only document negative incidents. In other words, you start with just like a clean slate, and only negative incidents get documented, and that's about it. And it was also presented as a way to help new companies access the DoD marketplace who are just going to get a neutral past performance rating anyway, because they don't have the past performance to get an outstanding or whatever in an evaluation. So House and Senate both passed that. The wording was different, but the substance was essentially the same. And they got together in a conference committee and then got cold feet for whatever reason. Someone pointed out enough drawbacks that they both retreated from that position. I had posted on this provision and I said, look, like I could see where they're coming from. There are good reasons why you might want to institute the system, but it also seems to adopt a kind of a good enough for government work mentality where you're encouraging mediocrity. Because if you can't get a positive past performance rating, you can only get a negative. What's the incentive to do anything more than what's the bare minimum? So maybe that's why they had second thoughts. So that's not been passed, even though it was passed by both House and Senate, didn't end up in the final bill. So those are the two items that didn't make it through. Let me talk about a couple that did make it through. First of all, there's a piece on bid protests and GAO bid protests in particular. So every year it seems that Congress is hearing from some within industry, but many within government saying, we're getting overrun with protests. There are too many protests, and we got to dial back on protests. Statistically, that's not true. Only 1 to 2% of acquisitions are protested, and the numbers actually declined quite a bit in recent years. But they're still hearing that. And one of the key problems that folks have identified, and I think this is a legitimate concern in some cases, is that the way the GAO's protest rules work, there's an incentive for incumbent contractors to protest to get an extension or option year of their contract. Because when you file a protest at GAO, there's an automatic stay of award or performance of the underlying contract. And what typically happens is because there's this stay, the incumbent usually gets an extension of their contract or bridge contract to keep performing the work to avoid some sort of thing where they might win the protest and then have to be retransitioned back on to the contract. That's not required, by the way. There's a case out there that was recently issued by the Court of Federal Claims that says during this automatic stay, the agency can bridge the work to anybody they want, basically, including the protester or including the incumbent or somebody else, including the protested company. But that's usually how it works. And so there's this notion that companies are protesting not because they think there's a flaw in the evaluation for real, but in order to just squeeze out an extra 90 to 100 days of profits essentially on their contract. So what this bill says is that in that scenario, when an incumbent contractor protests, a contracting officer could withhold up to 5% of the payment due during that extension or bridge contract period. Then, if the protest is dismissed as lacking any reasonable legal or factual basis, the DoD can keep the money. Otherwise, they have to pay the money. And so, in my opinion, it's kind of like a baby step toward addressing this problem. It at least puts something on the books to address the problem, but it doesn't do much because dismissal is different than denial. And so dismissal means you didn't even meet the bare technical requirements of filing a valid protest. You're gone. We're not even getting to a decision on the merits. And so the statute uses the word dismissed, which already takes a lot of protests that are just denied off the table. And then this any legal or factual basis lacking that essentially means a frivolous protest. And you're going to be hard pressed to find any halfway decent government attorney, contracts attorney who can't file a non-frivolous protest over almost any evaluation of any complexity, because frivolity is a very low bar. And in fact, the ethics rules under the American Bar Association and state bars prevent lawyers from filing frivolous items. And they shouldn't even be filing something that they think is frivolous, but it's a low bar to clear. You can go to your client and say, low probability of success. We have a legitimate argument, but we're looking at a 10% probably likelihood of success. That's not a frivolous protest. It's a low probability protest. And so I don't think that this is actually going to make much of a difference, but it does send a sign that the Congress is looking at this problem. It's like a step toward potentially doing more in the future. That's where I see this one going.
I would guess that the more frivolous protest probably comes in from the DIY protesters.
Yeah. So the folks at GAO, you don't necessarily need an attorney to file a protest. You can represent yourself. At least on any probably larger dollar type contract, it's unlikely that the incumbent is DIYing their own defense of their incumbent contract, but it does happen. And of course, the GAO hears protests at all sorts of different dollar levels and from companies that are small. And so, yeah, they may file something that's unintentionally frivolous and that they don't know enough about the law, because this is complex stuff, to know that their protest actually is frivolous. But that's probably where you're going to see that happen. It's where a penalty for companies that are maybe unintentionally filing frivolous protests just because they don't understand what the rules very well. Yeah.
And we've seen that. I know I got a call up from one of our Govology students and somebody in the community. It's just there was one person that just continued to just like protest everything. And he was so frustrated with it. And a lot of times the contracting officers would just capitulate because it was very frustrating to him. So I could see where hopefully maybe they're starting to find ways to curtail some of that, where somebody's just going to protest everything.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because I've seen all sorts of ideas floated by the procurement community. This is one of the first of Congress, other than just putting in dollar caps, like you can't protest task or delivery orders under certain dollar values. It's just a flat out ban. I'm generally wary of those things because when you just literally can't protest, you could have something that's really messed up evaluation. Keep in mind that about half of GAO protests get some sort of relief for the protester, either in the form of a sustain or the agency voluntarily taking some sort of corrective action. So there are a lot of non-frivolous protests that are being filed. So I'm wary about just putting caps on there, but there have been all sorts of other solutions that have been proposed by the contracting community. For example, someone said, hey, let's look at the NFL where you get so many chances
Yeah,
to ask for a
challenge
review,
flags.
right? You can throw the red flag twice, and if you win those challenges, you get a third. Maybe it's like protests. You can only file so many before. Who knows? That doesn't really necessarily work when you got a contractor who's going to bid one job per year versus someone who's bidding 1,000 jobs per year because they're huge. But you see how we're struggling to address that problem. So this is a step that direction. One other thing I'd like to point out about the NDAA, and I know we've got a lot of topics to cover, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on it, but there's a conceptual push in this NDAA toward expanding or trying to expand the universe of contractors who are able to successfully compete for and win DoD contracts, what is sometimes called your non-traditional contractors, although that's such a broad term as it's defined that it's almost meaningless. But folks who are not currently bidding or winning DoD contracts, because we've had this shrinking pool, both at DoD and in the government at large for the last 15 years or so, especially in small businesses, the number of prime contractors. The NDAA includes some fairly significant changes about when you have to be compliant with the CAS, the cost accounting standards, those sorts of financial things that I'm not an expert on anyway. I'm not going to get into in great detail, but basically trying to make that piece of the puzzle a little easier. And there's a section in there, Section 824 of this NDAA, that is trying to evaluate how we're using past performance. It's not the CPARS thing I talked about earlier, which part of that was aimed at trying to draw in more contractors who didn't have a existing record of prime contract performance. But there is a requirement in the NDAA that the DoD take a look at when it should have a policy on accepting non-governmental projects in past performance, what sort of alternatives might be available to past performance. This is interesting. DoD is supposed to consider what kind of alternatives might be available to past performance, like a pre-award demonstration of some sort of capability, something like that, and then go take a look at the DFARS especially and go through it with the mindset of eliminating procedures that might disproportionately affect small businesses and these other non-traditional defense contractors that want to bid. And so you'll see this kind of conceptual, philosophical strand throughout some of this NDAA of trying to find smart ways to bring in more contractors to the DoD base, to the industrial base supporting DoD. And so this is nothing that's going to be on the books yet, but you're going to see coming forward this look from DoD about how do we treat past performance? When is it really necessary that we take a hard look at it? When is it necessary that we have government past performance versus non-government? When can we potentially accept something else in lieu of past performance without just giving that neutral rating, which sometimes, depending on the competitive pool, can be really tough to overcome?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because definitely I think past performance is one of those blocking points for a lot of firms. And we see solicitations where a lot of times government says, hey, we welcome innovative ideas and solutions, and they want to look at new things, yet they want past performance, a lot of times agency specific past performance.
Yep.
So if you've got the new and innovative company coming in that could probably save the government money, do a lot of great things, meet the need better than the previous incumbent or the people who've got that, that's a really frustrating thing to see that go on over and over again. So I would love to just dive into that further, maybe later in the year with you and see where government is going with past performance and changes to that as they develop.
Yeah, I'll be very curious to see how that goes. And I do think that focus is important because I've seen that too as new entrants try to come into the government contracting market. It can be really tough to overcome the lack of government past performance, or sometimes, as you say, the lack of specific agency past performance. And that can prevent the contractors from wanting to enter the market, from being able to enter the market, or the government from being able to get really what's the best solution. So you have this kind of tension between we want to inspire and look at innovative solutions maybe from new entrants on the one hand versus this kind of risk aversion that's always there on the other. And so it's trying to find maybe a better middle ground between those two things where we're going with this NDAA.
Stephen, is that protestable? For example, like if you say you're welcoming new solutions, but the solicitation is so specific that really only maybe two people can
Right.
truly have a shot of getting it. Are you able to protest, or what would you advise? I know you're not here to give legal advice, but what would you suggest that somebody might do if they come across a solicitation like that where it's just, hey, I have this better mousetrap, this better solution, but the way that they've written up the solicitation, it doesn't allow for me to really get evaluated accordingly, right?
Yeah, and as a general matter, again, this is not legal advice whatsoever. This is just an overview of the landscape there. So yeah, as a general matter in a pre-award setting, these are challenges to the terms of the solicitation. A protest that challenges the terms of the solicitation generally has to be filed before the due date for proposals. Speak now or forever hold your peace. And so folks will wait until the government kicks out their solution and say, nope, nope, you didn't have past performance, and then they'll file the protest. The solicitation was unduly restrictive. It's too late then. But if before the solicitation's due, you can file that protest. You can say it's unduly restrictive of competition. Those can be tough protests to win. The GAO gives the government pretty broad discretion in terms of how it is, the requirements it puts in place to meet its needs. It is protestable. It's not necessarily going to be just dismissed flat out, but it could be a tough battle to win on that. That's one where the protest is the last resort in that one. It's really more about, in my mind, communicating with the agency ahead of the protest. That, in fact, a lot of times when a pre-award item was protestable, the way that my client won that protest was that we had discussions with the agency beforehand. And I would reach out and say, look, we really don't want to protest, but man, this thing is really restricted. My client has this great solution, but if you're insisting on that we've completed 3 recent relevant projects for your agency, we can't show that.
Yeah.
So is there anything that can be done? And sometimes the answer is no, but sometimes they'll dial back on that. And so having those communications up front can be helpful. You can keep the protest in your back pocket, but keep in mind that generally those are hard to win. But it's going to be a case by case thing. So that's a good time to talk to one of those contracts attorneys that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. Thank you. So let's move to the next topic, and it is on how has the competitive landscape changed for small businesses in 2005, and where do you see things heading in 2026? And maybe within that context, we can start off by talking about the 8A program, because December 5th, I think it was, we saw SBA drop this audit requirement that everybody in the 8A program had to respond to within 30 days, which was like, hey, Merry Christmas. But in addition to that, there was a bill that was passed to basically effectively prohibit some of the 8A sole source until this audit was completed. But then in effect, first of all, I guess, is there an update on that? But then secondly, even if that didn't pass, I believe there was a senator or somebody that was going to each agency and asking them not to award sole sources. So effectively really putting a big damper on potential sole source contracts as of probably right now. Maybe once we get towards the end of the year, that will change. But what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the 8A program is under pressure right now. There's no other way to say that. We've had, of course, you have this audit. The SBA was doing an audit before. Now they're doing a more in-depth audit of every 8A company. The Treasury Department said it was doing an audit. Then you had Secretary Hegseth recently come out and say, we're going to take a sledgehammer to the 8A program, whatever that even means. But essentially, if you look at the video, he published a line-by-line audit of the program, I think based on a misunderstanding that the program is quote-unquote DEI, which, if that's the mindset, you're arguing against a program that existed 5 years ago before the Ultima case took out any racial component to that program. So you're arguing about an old version of the program maybe, but not the current version. But be that as it may, it is a program that's under pressure. I think contractors should know that first things first, neither Secretary Hegseth nor DOD nor SBA itself, nor the administration by executive order have the authority to just get rid of the 8A program, whether we're using a sledgehammer or a machine gun or any other type of implement. Only Congress can get rid of the 8A program because it's a statutory program. It's right there baked into the U.S. code, and statutes can only be amended or repealed by Congress. Executive agencies don't have that power, and so the 8A program is not going to statutorily go away. But what is this steady drumbeat of items that are making it more difficult for 8A contractors between you've got your audit, then you had this bill you mentioned, which has not been passed. That was Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, though, had introduced a bill that would prevent the government from making any 8A sole source awards until the SBA audit is complete. That bill, to my knowledge, hasn't gone beyond committee, but she then wrote a letter to the heads of each of the agencies that have 8A authority asking them to voluntarily suspend the use of 8A sole source awards. And I think for 8A contractors, I really think that this whole line of items that you see, this whole collection pressure on the 8A program, that's really the pressure point to me. It's not that the DOD is going to revoke the 8A program. They can't do that. The administration can't do that. The president can't publish an executive order revoking the program. But what they can do is stop using it as much. There's a goal, an unenforceable goal for SDBs, small disadvantaged businesses, for which the 8A is just a certified SDB. But when you have this drumbeat of kind of 8A pressure on that program, along with some sort of inflammatory comments about it being DEI, then it's sending the message to the folks who are responsible for awarding those contracts and for picking the vehicles under which those contracts are awarded that 8A is out of favor, that we don't want to use 8A. And then you combine that with the recent change under the Revolutionary Fire overhaul that made a big exception to the once 8A, always 8A policy, because there's this policy called once 8A, always 8A that says incumbent contracts are within the 8A program usually have to continue on that program for the follow-on. Under the Revolutionary Fire overhaul, as of October, there's an exception that says you can just pull it out to put it under an SDVOSB or a hub zone or women-owned small business set-aside as well. So you combine all those things together, and I think really what you're not going to see, people say the 8A program is going to be terminated. No, I don't think it is. I don't think you're going to get that bill through Congress. I really don't. I can't see, for example, even though they're Republicans, the Alaska senators voting for that because of all the revenues that those 8A dollars generate for their state. Maybe I'm wrong, but that would be my guess. So I don't think that bill gets through Congress, but that would ever repeal or significantly weaken the 8A program. But when you have the secretary of an agency saying, we want to take a sledgehammer to the program, the implied message for the folks who are responsible for deciding whether to use that program is, I don't want to get in trouble for using a program that's falling out of favor. Maybe I'll find a different vehicle. That's where I see the real risk for 8A firms is not some sort of big statutory change, but just how the program is being used on the ground under this pressure.
Yeah. So what would be your suggestion, both for people who are currently in the program as well as those who are thinking about getting into the program? What would you tell them maybe to think about or to consider for this year?
Yeah, I would say that keep in mind that right now what you've got, it's still a good program. It's in the statutes. I don't think in the long term or in the midterm at least it's going anywhere. But first of all, if you're applying or thinking about applying, think about, is this the right environment that you want to do it, right? Because 8A has a 9-year maximum term. If it's me and I'm eligible, I might think about whether I want to push off my application in the future. If I have any ear on policymakers, by the way, I want to be educating them that, hey, this is not a DEI program. That yes, in the past there was a preference for one of the many eligibility factors for companies that were owned or controlled by members of certain racial or ethnic groups. That has been wiped off the books by a court decision in 2023. It doesn't exist anymore. And so there's not a racial preference in the program anymore. And so people are operating under an assumption that it's just no longer valid. And so if that message can get it through to folks who are like anti-DEI, that this program just isn't that what you think it is anymore, that might help as well on a policy perspective. But if I'm thinking about applying, I'd be like, no, I'm really not interested anymore. If you're active 8A participant, your hands are tied. You're in there. You don't get to just suspend your 9 years and then re-up it if and when the environment changes. You're stuck where you are. So I think you just keep plugging forward, hoping that your specific contracting officers continue to like your work enough and to value your work enough that they're going to award to you, whether that's through a sole source or they're going to continue to do 8A set-asides, but keeping in mind that this is an opportunity to rethink your potential reliance on 8A dollars. The 8A program already has this idea of reliance on the 8A program where you're supposed to show these non-8A business mix targets, they call it, as you approach your last 4 or 5 years in the program. This is really a warning bell that you want to be thinking about small business set-asides, and if you're eligible for another certification like an SDVOSB, woman-owned, or hub zone, it might be worth thinking about getting that certification too, so that you have other avenues that aren't just 8A for your dollars.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And just because there's a lot of pressure now on agencies, and I say a lot of pressure because when a senator is coming down and saying don't award, that's a lot of pressure for
It's a
an
lot of
agency.
pressure. Yeah.
Because I remember working at the SBA when you got a congressional inquiry, you're like everything stops and that gets the attention of it. So I can see that the sole sources might be diminished. It doesn't mean that they still have the 5% goal to meet for SDB, which they typically do through the 8A program. But maybe the contractors this year will see more competitive 8A set asides instead of sole source contracts. But it's also going to be interesting to see what happens towards the fourth quarter because that 8A vehicle is often a benefit to the government when they're in a crunch to get dollars awarded and they don't have time to go to competition. And so if you track spending stats like on USA Spending, you see the 8A spend is like the last month is like boom, it's always up there. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes of that. Anything else with regards to the other small businesses in general, as well as the other socioeconomic categories for WOSB, SDVOSB, HubZone?
Yeah, and just to back up just 1 second, one more thing I thought about for active 8As that I think is really critical, and then we'll turn to the other certs, is be 100% sure that you are comfortable that you're meeting the limitations on subcontracting on each contract. Because when they're doing this audit, that is one of the key things they're looking at.
Yeah.
The company that kind of that got in the news that kicked off this was an allegation that they didn't meet the limitation on subcontracting. And those rules can be complicated and hard to understand how they work with respect to similarly situated entity and what work counts and what work doesn't, how you track it. So be sure that you're comfortable that you're not only meeting those limits, but tracking them, and you can show the SBA, anybody else who asks, an inspector general, yeah, we met our limitation on subcontracting. We're not some pass through, because that's been the kind of the crux of some of these audit allegations.
By the way, we do have a course on
Oh, yeah.
Govology on limitations on
Oh, yes.
subcontracting. If you don't know what that is, definitely go and understand that because that is critical. And if I think, Stephen, just a quick thought here is that a lot of times people can get away with stuff for a long time because it's not basically audited a lot in the government. Like a lot of state agencies, they do audits every year, but the government, they don't typically audit like the state agencies do unless there's something that they want to audit. But once they do, that's when now, like, you could have probably been non-compliant with limitations on subcontracting, been winning contracts for 5 years. Oh my gosh, now you're going to be calling that GovCon attorney. What do? I didn't understand it. I signed off the terms and conditions like I do when I click on my Apple agreement.
Yeah, and
it's important things to understand. And we try to reiterate this and hit this, the importance of understanding the compliance elements going into that, because when they do these audits, man, you don't want to be on the wrong side of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And this limitation on subcontracting is kind of the centerpiece. That's, I think, at least the public case that kicked this off, and one of the key focuses of this audit. If there are audits in other programs, that's going to be a key focus there too, because we don't want these companies to be serving as pass-throughs where they're not allowed to do that. And this is against a backdrop where not maybe so much in the last 6 months or so, but before that, we're hearing a lot of folks talking about this middleman approach to government contracting, how you could make a bunch of money without doing the work by subbing it all to somebody else.
Yeah.
Every now and then that's correct, but in often cases when you watch these videos or saw these gurus pushing this approach, what they were pushing was something that was a blatant violation of limitation on subcontracting. And so anybody who's been taking that approach might be extra cautious moving forward and maybe call an attorney in advance to get a review of what they've done up to now. And some of these times, these things can be fixed on the fly. If you're out of balance with your limitation on subcontracting on an active contract, you may be able to flip that and get to the right balance by the time that contract or that period of performance ends. So don't just sleep on that as well. So to turn quickly to the other programs, there's not as much action on those programs right now. I think it's going to be interesting to see, and that's your women-owned, your HubZone, and your SDVOSB programs, what happens with those programs this year. If this 8A audit is being driven primarily by trying to root out fraud, waste, and abuse, which is absolutely a legitimate government objective, then participants in all three of those programs should expect that they may be next to be audited for those types of things. If it is being driven more by anti-DEI sentiments than by fraud, waste, and abuse, then WSB is likely the next target. That's just my personal opinion. So we'll see. But I think participants in all three of those programs should be prepared that they may be next to face such an audit. I think that one of the key differences, other than the potential motivations for the audit between those, is that the 8A program, just a lot more dollars are going through than some of these other programs through 8A vehicles than through, for example, woman-owned small business, which only accounted for less than 0.5% of federal prime contract spend went through WSB vehicles. So there's just a lot less spend that's being affected by that. But keep your eyes peeled if you're in one of those programs. No major news at the moment, but it's a good time to get your ducks in a row and make sure that you too are complying with the limitations on subcontracting, doing things by the book, and maybe even take a look at the SBA's audit letter and say, if they come to my program next, could I supply all these things and be ready? Anything you don't think you can do, have a strategy to have that available so you're not caught off guard either.
Yeah, I think where one opportunity is opening up is something that you mentioned earlier with this new regulation that's passed that takes away that once an 8A, always an 8A. And effectively what that meant was that if a requirement was put into the 8A program, then it would stay in the 8A. So when the 8A firm graduated, it would have to go to another 8A firm. And I think that opportunity provides is that for service disabled veterans, women-owned, others now, that the agency can take that requirement and basically do a set aside in one of those different areas. And I think it's strategic from a teaming perspective, because typically if you were a graduating 8A, you would probably only look to another new and up and coming 8A to get behind and be a mentor to, because that contract was going to stay in the 8A program. But now, like if you are a women-owned HUBZone service disabled veteran, perhaps if you're doing your historical market research, like we teach a lot on Govology, and you're seeing where those contracts are historically been inside of the 8A, and you're building some relationships with maybe incumbents or maybe not. Maybe you just see this as a new opportunity to get it opened up and to watch for it and maybe to prepare for it, because maybe next time it comes around, it's not going to be an 8A set aside.
Yeah, and in fact, I think if you're an incumbent 8A, this change to the once 8A, always 8A rule, which again loosens that rule and says this work that usually if it's incumbent work and they're doing a follow-on contract, it's not going to apply to everybody. If you're a construction contractor, for example, you don't see a lot of this stuff. But for folks in the services field where the agency's buying the same stuff maybe every 5 years, same contract, follow-on contract, once it's put in the 8A program, it basically stays there, barring certain exceptions. And now under the revolutionary fire overhaul of Fire Part 19, the agency, without going to SBA, can just pull that out to make it a woman-owned small business set aside, an SDVOSB set aside, or a HUBZone set aside. It's still a little iffy whether that's authority that's available right now until the SBA changes its own regulations, but that's where we're heading. SBA is going to conform its regulations to that. And so I do think that also increases the value for current 8As, especially those who are approaching a graduation deadline, but even in this kind of pressure 8A environment of having multiple certifications. Because if you're an 8A and the contract officer really likes your work, your contract's coming to an end, normally it would stay within the 8A program. The contract officer might already be thinking, like, maybe given what the secretary is talking about sledgehammers, if this is a DoD contract, I want to find some other vehicle. If you're also a HUBZone, you say, hey, you know what's a good vehicle? You really liked our work. How about HUBZone? They don't have to do that, but there's nothing stopping you from saying that. And they say, hey, we could actually take this out of the 8A program, which might make our bosses happier with us. We can keep it in an environment where our current incumbent that we're happy with can compete it, and we can get to a HUBZone goal that a lot of agencies aren't meeting. The government as a whole is still not meeting the 3% HUBZone goal. There's a lot to like about that. And so I think for an incumbent 8A, having those multiple certifications could actually help hold on to some of that work. And unlike 8A, none of these other 3 certifications have a 9-year or any firm expiration date. They only expire when you no longer qualify by size or some other reason.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the last topic of the day here, and then we'll shift over into the Q&A. But we're going to talk a little bit about pending FAR and DFAR regulations that contracts need to know about this year. I know you've got a few up your sleeve there, but we could also segue the discussion that you and I were having offline about what's going on with some of the SAM registrations. It's something that's important that I think some changes in SAM could potentially trip some people up this year if they're not careful. Let's start off with the non-SAM stuff first, and then we'll go into the SAM registration.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'm going to let you handle the SAM registration stuff, because I saw that Carroll's written a draft of something on that change, and it's pretty comprehensive. So every month, the FAR Council and the DoD publish what they call their case reports. And those are their lists of pending regulations that they're working on for future additions to the FAR and the DFARs. And so anybody can go there. And if you just go to your favorite search engine and Google FAR case report or DFAR's case report, you can get the same information that I often just look at to see where some of these rules are, what's pending, what's not pending. And you'll see a lot more information than what we're able to cover in a session like this, because there are all sorts of different proposals out there that have been instituted either by congressional requirement through like an NDAA or by an executive order. And the president, about a year ago when he first took office, issued a lot of executive orders that they're still working on some of the rules for some of those. So FAR case report, DFAR's case report, it'll make you look smart at parties when you come out and you can tell people what's common in the regulation. Yeah, people maybe
Certain parties.
if you go to the cool parties like we go to.
Those parties in Kansas?
Yeah, everybody's this is how you make friends and influence
with
people.
The KNP
right?
team.
That's right. Maybe this is why people tend to say, "Oh, I gotta go to the bathroom." They wander off when I come talk to them at a party. I'll have to think about that. Yeah. So first things first. When you look at the FAR Open Case Report, and what you're going to see now is a whole list of rules for the revolutionary FAR overhaul to turn those into FAR rules. And you may say, we already have FAR rules for the revolutionary FAR overhaul. We're already using them. No, what we're using right now are temporary deviations. And so the revolutionary FAR overhaul is being used by, as far as I know, pretty much every agency now. They had to adopt an agency by using what's called deviation from the existing FAR. But the existing FAR is still there. Like the revolutionary FAR overhaul is just it's like, here's the FAR. And now we've got a little deviation, it's a little path off the deviation. So we've got two versions of the FAR right now. We've got the base FAR and the RFO deviation, which is what most, if not all, agencies are using right now. But that's intended to be a temporary thing. And you and I know, Carroll, because we did a big class on this called the Administrative Procedure Act and Rulemaking. There's a whole process that the government has to go through, that federal agencies have to go through when they make regulations, especially ones that are going to impact significant number of folks, which these changes certainly do, and that involves publication in the Federal Register, receipt of public comments, all sorts of things that are laid out in statute under the Administrative Procedure Act and other complementary statutes. And so that's the process we're going to see this year. And so the RFO has been approached in kind of this odd way where they've done it by deviation to get it done quickly. They've taken informal comment. There was a feedback that they want informally on what they've done already, but now it's coming the formal stuff. So this year we're going to see formal rulemakings published and the opportunity for the public to weigh in a formal way on what's been done already on revolutionary FAR overhaul. So what we see now is not necessarily the RFO that's going to exist a year from now. Rules are always changing, but this year more potential for that than ever, given that we haven't been through the formal comment stuff yet for these rules, and industry groups and individuals and other businesses are going to be, I'm sure, putting in their 2 cents in now a formal Federal Register way on these changes. So look for that. And if there are rules that are affecting you positively, negatively, or otherwise in the revolutionary FAR overhaul, this is your chance to weigh in a way that is statutory, in a way that's the most formal way that you can weigh in. So be prepared to do that. One other rule that I want to highlight, but I want to make sure you get a chance to talk about SAM, especially if you do business with the DoD or DOW, about Section 847. What is that? Section 847 actually goes all the way back to the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. Yes, they are still working on a rule for the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. It's a big deal, though. Sometimes these rules take a long time. If you do the math, you're like, hey, that's longer than it took us to fight and win World War II. Yeah, it's true. It's taken this long to write this rule, but it's supposedly coming this year because they've done the proposed rule, and now that's a good sign that the final is probably coming, I would guess, in the next 6 months or so. It's been pushed back for a while, but we finally have a proposal. Section 847, when you hear that, that is essentially the expansion of the concept of FOCI, foreign ownership, control, and influence, to unclassified DoD contracts. And so FOCI right now is a concept about whether a company is, in the eyes of typically the Intelligence and Cybersecurity Agency, DCSA, whether you're under foreign ownership, control, or influence. And that is necessary that you're not under FOCI in order to get an FCL, facility security clearance. And that applies only to contracts that have classified information that require that FCL. And so there are only, as I understand it, about 2,000 contractors right now that really need to access that level, that have that sort of FOCI evaluation going on. This actually expands the FOCI evaluation to many other DoD contracts. It says that Section 847 says that FOCI analysis will occur on any DoD contract or subcontract over $5 million. There is a major exception for certain commercial items contracts. It's not going to be every contract. A lot fall into the commercial items bucket. But in the estimation of the government, now we're going to go from 2,000 contractors that are affected by a foci analysis to 40,000 contractors. About 20 times more contractors are going to be affected by it. Now, this doesn't mean these contractors need to get an FCL, but it does mean that when they're bidding these contracts, they're going to have to give the government foci type information about whether their company has any sort of foreign ownership, control, or influence. DCSA is then going to get involved and evaluate that information, make recommendations to the contracting officer, which may be no problem, nothing to see here. It may be there's a potential foci issue that if you're going to award this contract, they need to mitigate it in some way. Or it may be that, wow, we don't think that you should award the contract to this company because of a potential foci issue. It'll ultimately, at least under the proposal, be up to the contracting officer, though, what to do with that. And so if there's any sort of foreign ownership, control, or influence in the company in any way, and that's a pretty broad consideration, especially once you go beyond the ownership level and you do business with DoD, even at the subcontract level, these principles could start to affect you potentially later this year. And so that Section 847, it's a good thing for those who are forward-thinking contractors to get ahead of and think about, hey, should we do an internal kind of foci audit of ourselves, a self-audit of some sort, to see if we have any problems and potentially mitigate them beforehand before DCSA that's making a recommendation as to whether the government should award us a contract or whether we can't get the contract unless we fire our CEO who's a citizen of another country or whatever the case may be. Definitely something for a lot of contractors who do business with DoD/DOW to keep in mind.
Yeah. Awesome, man. And I'm guessing maybe that'll be something that they'll include in the new reps and certs for Sam, which is the perfect segue.
They're talking about having folks who now fill out the same SF 328 that you fill out to get an FCL. We'll have to see how it all ends up in terms of, we're not trying to do the full-blown FCL process on these companies because they're not trying to access classified information. And this is another kind of philosophical strain you'll see when you look through those proposed rules. We're still trying to make sure that companies aren't under this sort of foreign ownership, control, or influence, especially, and it doesn't say this in the rules, but I think especially when it comes to certain countries with whom we have a more adversarial relationship. Then some of the other rules you'll see specifically call out countries of concern. They call out China, they call out Russia, adversaries like that.
All right. I'm going to do a very quick heads up on something that initially I saw in a piece that you had written related to some sam.gov changes, and I did some deep diving in this, and we're getting ready to actually publish an article. Thank you, by the way, Stephen, for taking a look at it and giving some comments to this article to make sure I got everything 100% here. But essentially what's happening is, again, the FAR 2.0 has made some changes. One of the things that is looking like it's going to change here in 2026, and part of it has to do with some FAR 2.0, some FAR Part 4 administrative matters, but it also does with efficiency and making things, I think, a little bit make more sense and a little bit easier for contractors to get registered. As you guys know, if you've registered at sam.gov, there's a lot of information that you've got to plug into that system. And one of those pieces that ask a lot of questions that actually Stephen did a really nice video with us on was going through each of those sections of representations and certifications. Historically, going back in time, that used to be a part of the solicitation before we had electronic means. Every contractor would read Section K in their federal proposals. It would have these reps and certs that we go through and certify. Then we got smart and said, hey, we could do this online. And then there was a system called ORCA, online reps and certs, that was set up, and it was a separate system. So when you used to register the old central contractor registry, then you had to do the ORCA. Then when sam.gov came along, they combined it. The problem with it is that there are a lot of solicitation specific reps and certs in there, and people just go in and they do their SAM registration, think I'm done with it for the year, but nobody's really probably going back in and to verify or update the specifics to the solicitation that they are bidding on. Effectively, what's happening here is, in a nutshell, it looks like there's going to be a transition where they're going to, once again, kind of separate some of those reps and certs, and they're just going to stick with like entity level information in SAM registration, which is what's relevant to you as an entity. But any procurement specific reps and certs or offer specific if you're submitting an offer. Those will likely be something that will be done separately with the solicitation. And those might be in a separate online system. Again, maybe something like Orca where you have to go in electronically, do an update on your reps and certs along with your submission. Perhaps I don't think that they would get back into the old where you do like Section K every time in its entirety. Here's the important thing to really watch for, I believe, this year and to take away from this. Section K, again, even when this was all combined into sam.gov, I had always recommended that folks look at Section K because that agency might want you to actually reattest or recertify or represent yourself in terms of, are you still like a WSB, something like that. We would see that sometimes. Now, if you didn't reply to that one little thing, because we used to see these as, hey, if you filled out online reps and certs, the language didn't say you're pretty much good to go, but that's the gist of it. But it would say, but here, fill this out. And if you didn't fill that one thing out, you could be perhaps non-compliant, non-responsive to the contract. What's going to happen is that you're probably going to see once this transition happens, that more things are going to come back into the Section K. And so what we're advising here is to really this year pay particularly attention to this Section K within the solicitations that you receive, because you might see some extra requirements there that if you don't do, that could be cause for you to basically not be awarded a contract. And we really don't want to see that for the folks that tune in here. So that's the heads up. And Stephen, maybe later in the year when this finally does come and be finalized, we could do a whole episode around this and dive into a little bit deeper on this. But I think going back with this and with what Stephen also just mentioned about like how everything's changing with the FARs and the DFARs and the RFO, and it can make you really go insane. And I think to keep your sanity, the tip that I would say, same thing as what I just mentioned with look at Section K. Make sure you're watching the solicitations this year carefully, because if you're not like at the same parties, the nerd parties that Stephen and I hang out with that talks about this all the time, I know that you don't have time to keep up with it, but it will be in your solicitation. So if you didn't catch it anywhere else, it will be in your solicitation. Watch those solicitations carefully this year is my best tip.
Yeah, it's a good summary and good advice, and just a lot of changes coming. Last year was extremely impactful for government contractors, and 2026 is going to be as well. So stay tuned. We got a lot more coming this year with all the upcoming RFO stuff, with these changes to SAM, with Section 847, and with probably 100 other things that we haven't predicted yet, but that are going to happen this year, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think they just couldn't get to a consensus on to what went in that bill to get it done as part of the NDAA.
And if I were to take a guess, I would guess that would be did again, because the DoD in particular, as you mentioned earlier, Stephen, we've seen this like this dwindling supply base, but at the same time, the DoD has 21 emerging technologies that they're putting a lot of emphasis on, and a lot of the Apex accelerators out there that are under the DoD's Office of Small Business Programs have been tasked with helping the DoD find these innovative firms that are bringing these critical and emerging technologies to the forefront. This is one of the key programs that can help with that, among others. So my guess is that probably just stand by, but there is also other pathways. So I would encourage you guys that if you're an innovative type of firm, reach out to your local Apex accelerators, see what maybe resources they have in your state that they could tie you in with. That was a great discussion, Stephen. Thank you so much for the extra time today, and I hope you join us next month. Stephen, do you have any last things you wanted to share before we head out?
No, it's been a great discussion. Yeah, we'll talk about maybe extending these so we can make sure we get to folks. In the meantime, Happy New Year to you again, Carroll, and to everyone who's watching. See you next month.
All right. Thank you. See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.